Go ahead, move over there. I'll sit here where you will.
I'd like to welcome everyone tonight, especially our guests. If you're interested in joining the Elizabethville Area Historical Society, see me after the meeting and I'll give you a brochure, tell you what it's about, and we'd love to have you. Our speaker this evening is Karl Schader. I don't know Karl very well. I've only met him recently, but I know his wife, Janie Hassinger Schader. Janie grew up in Elizabethville, and I think she had wonderful parents, but I think the one that I remember the most is her father's roses. And whenever he came to pay his taxes, he talked about the shady maple. Yeah. I asked Karl where he grew up, and he said everywhere. He was an Army brat?
I was an Army brat.
Army brat, yeah. So I won't even go into all of those places. They met in Harrisburg. They lived in Ephrata and several other places. And Jane taught music at Eastern York. And I think she's still using her talents in the area with lessons and at her church. And Karl, I don't have to tell you what he did. He'll be telling you all about it. So I'll introduce Karl Schader. Welcome, Karl.
Hey, all right, let's try this out. Okay, here we go. I probably don't need this because I'm pretty loud. My name is Karl Schader, and to give you my background, actually the day after I graduated from high school, I joined the Army. And after the Army, I went to college for 4 years, Bachelor of Aeronautical Science, Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. And then I was the Air Traffic Controller of Federal Aviation Administration for 30 years. So I retired from the government with 34 years. When I was asked to talk about air traffic control, I realized that it was going to be just too much. So I'm going to break the subject down. I'm going to be talking about 3 hours. I'm going to be talking about 3 hours, one airplane, 9/11. I was there. That's what I'm going to talk about. There's been documentaries done on 9/11. Two good ones are the Smithsonian Channel and the National Geographic Channel. I highly recommend them. But there's one aspect about it they didn't touch upon, and I suspect it was just they felt there was too much to it. So I'm going to give you the setting of where our story is. I'm going to give you a little history. I got to teach you a couple technical points so you can follow the story on 9/11. And so you're going to have to bear with me. And at the end of it, I will answer questions. I retired from Philadelphia International Airport. A Philly controller, you will work in the control tower at the International Airport, and you also work in what they call a radar approach departure control. It's a big facility downstairs. Okay. Philadelphia Tower averages 1,700 landing and departures a day. That's a lot of airplanes. See, especially you consider part of the day things slow down. So we have 6 1-hour periods. We do 120 airplanes an hour. That's 2 a minute. Philadelphia approach, the radar room downstairs, averages 2,800 airplanes a day. Okay. I want to paint a picture for you here, and we're going to be talking about the approach control because that's where I was at, and that's where I'm going to be telling the story from. Philadelphia approach has 11 radar sectors. So think of 11 radar scopes with 11 air traffic controllers sitting there, okay? And owns from the service to 18,000. Well, what people don't realize is our airspace is part of Pennsylvania, of course, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware. So the radar facility is responsible, or was responsible, for 5 airports with control towers. We were the radar facility for them. That's Philadelphia International, Northeast Philadelphia, Trenton, Wilmington, Delaware, and Navy Willow Grove, which is now closed for financial reasons, and several uncontrolled airports. What I like to try to explain to people is there's just no such thing as free flight in the Eastern Corridor because it's so busy. So Philadelphia approached those 11 sectors. All those airspaces are layered with jobs. And we're all next to each other, or we're below each other, or above each other in airspace. And we work airliners through, descending in, climbing out, up to higher altitudes, and we hand those airplanes off from sector to sector. So we have to be able to work together, and we do. Now, I always used to tell my students, because I was a trainer in Philadelphia and later in my career, I would say when you come to the Eastern Corridor, just like if you go to the West Coast, we're like one big aircraft carrier. An aircraft carrier turns into the wind when the fighters land. They react to the weather. We have California flows, we have Florida flows, we have European flows, so we react together. So like if Philly does something, New York's doing it. The DC airports are doing it. We do it together. So the reason I'm telling you this, I want you to understand the picture that day. You have Philadelphia approach, and it's this huge approach control, right? But to the north of us is New York TRACON. And New York TRACON, they're responsible. They're a big radar facility, right? And they're responsible for Newark, Kennedy, LaGuardia, Teterboro, White Plain, and Morristown, okay? They're humping. They're busy. They're our sister facility. So when I'm working certain Philly sectors, I'm working, there's a New York controller in my ear. We're sending planes back and forth. We're coordinating. To the south of us is Potomac approach control. In Potomac, they take care of the DC airports. Washington Dulles, Washington National, BWI, Andrews Air Force Base. Same thing, we're working together. What affects one of us affects all of us. And then above us, out on Long Island, there's New York Center. And it's a huge facility, 50 radar sectors, high altitude. Europe, over the top, fast. We get them to them, we move them fast, right? They run from the center line of Philly Airport north. To the south is Washington Center. Same idea, huge facility, right? To the west, Cleveland Center. And then there's smaller airports on our boundary that we butt up against, so we work with them. And they got smaller airports with towers and approach controls. That'd be like Allentown, Reading, Atlantic City, Harrisburg. So the whole East Coast is like this one big facility working together. You know, the winds change our flows. How we go to Florida, like we might go over the Atlantic one day. If thunderstorms were coming up through the center, we're all moving together, big Congo line. So I gotta give you a little history lesson. So bear with me. In 1956, over the Grand Canyon, a Constellation, a TWA Constellation, departed Los Angeles International Airport. And they used to meter by time. And after that, a United DC-7 departed. And they were over the Grand Canyon at 21,000 feet in what they call uncontrolled airspace. Because aviation had blown up, there was no regulation. The Civil Air Authority had no guidelines and laws, and the airlines were just shoving airplanes in the air. So aviation was growing quicker than our ability to control it. The DC-7 overtook the Constellation at 21,000, ran into the tail of the aircraft. All 128 people died, went into the Grand Canyon. Hard to believe in today to think like that. Well, the government got involved and had meetings, and of course, argued funding. And they said, well, we got to do something here. We've got to come up with a better technology with the way aviation is blowing up. They have the technology so people could travel across country to be safe. So at that time, the air traffic control system was disjointed. Like I told you, you're over the Grand Canyon, you're flying from LAX, I think the one was going to Chicago. You think it was uncontrolled airspace. The pilots were flying by VFR, visual flight rules, CNBC. And the one airliner just overran the other one. So obviously we got to come up with a better way of doing things. Well, the technology we were using was basically left over from World War II. Okay, they had a thing called primary radar, and bear with me here, okay? You have the radar antenna, it turns. You've watched the old monster movies or old war movies, and the antenna's turning, it sends a signal out. And it hits the mast of the airplane over here. And then it sends a signal back to the radar scope, and it puts a little blip, like the submarine war movies, blip, blip, right? So, well, the controllers the highest technology we had at the time were these flat radar scopes. And the controller would sit over the top of his radar scope, and he'd have a blip, and he'd say, "Who are you?" And the guy would say, "Well, I'm TWA 629, I'm a Constellation, I'm at 21,000 feet, I'm doing 210 knots, and I'm on a 050 heading." And the controller would take a piece of paper and write that information on it. And we called them shrimp boats. Well, I wasn't around, but they called it shrimp boats. And they'd move these shrimp boats on this radar scope, these blips, but it was getting busier and busier and busier. And the other thing you have to remember is air traffic control, that's one plane. So all these targets are depicted in one plane. Now, an air traffic controller controls in 3 dimensions. If you think that, like in the ocean, right? Dimensions. Not everybody's the same altitude. So obviously the technology was not going to hold up. So the government was outraged, like they always are. They're like, unfair, somebody needs to lose their job. And they said, well, we got to come with an organization that can regulate the airlines, that can modernize air traffic control. So in 1958, the Federal Aviation Administration was founded. And that's who I worked for, go FAA. So anyway, they realized that they had to do something about the technology. So they said, you know what, we're going to put these transmitters all over the country. We're going to call them, they're called VORs. And they transmit in Morse code 3 letters and on a frequency. And then they'd have another transmitter over here, and it would be in Morse code 3 letters and another frequency. And then later on, they added voice. And a pilot can dial in that frequency, and draw a line in space, and fly that direct line through space. You know what this is? It's I-81, I-95. It's a highway in the sky. 18,000 feet below, we call them Victor Airways. Flight level 180 up, we call them jet routes. So now air traffic controllers could route a flight. They could say, you're cleared from Harrisburg International via the Harrisburg VOR, HAR, Victor 210, Lancaster, LRB, and land in Lancaster Airport. And air traffic control, once he got that pilot off and got him on that airway, he knew exactly where he was going to be. You can see where this would be advantageous and also safe. Then they said, well, that's not enough. We're going to come up with this direction of flight thing. So if you take a compass and you say 360 is direct north, and you go from 360 to 179, all those airplanes were on odd altitudes. And still are. And from 180 to 359, even altitudes. Can you see how that could kind of help? Because you know, if he's on even altitude, you kind of know which way he's going. Odd altitude, you kind of know which way he's going. Then they said, well, this is not enough. The British during World War II, a little more history, there will not be a test. The British in World War II discovered that when their bombers were coming back from raids over Germany, the Germans realized it was only primary radar. And they would take their fighters and mix in with them. Because the bomber crews would be very scattered out after a bombing mission, right? And they would sneak in, the air defense, air defense would not respond to it. And so the Germans were sneaking in. So this British scientist invented this thing called a transponder. And it's a transmitter in the cockpit. Have you ever watched a war movie where they go friend or foe? They go friend and foe, they challenge. Well, this was an aviation challenge. Meaning they could put like a digit or a code in the cockpit of the airplane. A secondary transmitter would send something out. The British radar operators would look and go, well, that's one of ours. That is not one of ours. And they'd shoot them down. So that's where transponders came from. There is a reason I brought that up. Because now, let's go back to that Grand Canyon thing. One of the things they realized is if we knew the altitude of aircraft, that would help air traffic controllers. This would be a great tool. And you have all the stratus of airspace to the max of what a performance of an aircraft is. So they said, well, we've got to take this transponder technology and take it farther. And they did. So, even today, if I'm an air traffic controller and I'm sitting in a radar position and I tell an airliner squawk 4321, okay? He has a secondary transmitter, he dials those codes in, okay? He hits, I go ident, he hits ident, it blooms. In today's world on a computer, I'm on a keyboard, I enter and I go, that's Southwest 629 and Boeing 737. I issue him the barometric pressure, I can figure out his altitude. They even upgraded the data on it, so now I get a data block that appears next to the target of the aircraft. It says Southwest 629, Boeing 737, altitude, speed. Can you see why that would be important? That'd be great. Now, let's go back to that vertical separation we talked about and those altitudes. What that enables me to do as an air traffic controller, and I do it all the time, or I did it all the time, is I owned 18,000 feet. I could have airplanes in the same point of space 1,000 feet vertically apart. Because when you issue a barometric pressure to an aircraft, your altitude is valid within 500 feet. So, think about this. Here I am as a controller. I can have a guy there at 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 to 18,000 feet, and I know they're separated. So the job for me begins when I got to send them to an airport, or bring them out of an airport, or get them over the top to go fast. Now, there's all kinds of other separations, like Monopoly game. That's what I used to tell my students. Learn the rules of the Monopoly game. You can do lateral separation, degrees divergence, 15 degrees more, 3 miles, visual separation. That's how we get planes up and down. But I want you to remember the concept of vertical separation and transponder. That's why I told you that. This is why I'm telling you this story. So, September 11th, 01, bad day for air traffic control. United 93 departs Newark Airport to San Francisco, Boeing 757, 44 people, 4 hijackers, who would ultimately crash in Shanksville. Okay? This is our one airplane. This is the airplane we're going to follow. So it's 3 airplanes, 9/11, right? I'm sorry, 3 hours, 1 airplane, 9/11, okay? 993 takes off from Newark, climbing southbound. The New York Departure Control has issued a transponder code, identifies aircraft, verifies altitude. He's climbing out like normal. Pretty quickly we knew we had a problem. Now you gotta remember I told you we're all up against each other. So that Departure Control New York, he's climbing southbound United. There's a position at Philly called North Departure, and he's got about 20 airplanes climbing like this in his face. And it's all coordinated, we know what we're doing. But now, this is where it all changes. We have squawk codes, and we have words that mean things between pilots and controllers. And there's a series of them that let us know that there's somebody that has an unlawful entry of the cockpit. That was passed on. So the United took off 9:30. I wasn't that sector, but the aircraft started to radically descend it decreased its speed, increase its speed. Well, controllers assigned speed to a pilot, so we knew something was up. Erratic right and left turns, erratic climbs and descents. We got airplanes underneath them and above them, so we're using that vertical separation. This is a problem. At 9:45 a.m., the command center, Washington, D.C., for the first time ever, hasn't happened since, shut down the national airspace system. Never happened before, hope it never happens again. To be honest with you, I didn't even know we could do it. There was a mad scramble. At that point, we knew we had 4 aircraft. We thought there were 7. There were 3 others that we were getting weird responses from. So we're responding to that. So now I want you to think about it. Here's the Eastern Corridor. Boston, New York, D.C. Guys are turning airplanes. We did a thing. We had actually an emergency procedure where you do every other. You go 270, 90, 270, 90, west to east, west, east. Reduce speed to least practical speed so you don't follow the air. And just to buy yourself time. Order came down. They stopped all airplanes at all the airports. We started. Now we have the order to put every airplane on the ground. And what that meant was, if you were here and you were flying to San Francisco, and I had an airfield there, and they could accommodate you, I was putting you on the ground. Okay? We had to think about length of runway and stress test and capacity of the airport. Now, we did catch 2 breaks. And I hate to speak in terms of catching breaks on such a horrific day. but we did catch 2 breaks. Once you think about the West Coast, it's 6:30 in the morning on the West Coast. Anybody that's flown knows everybody wants to fly 7, 8, 9 a.m. You may get your clearance while you're moving on a tarmac, and there are earlier flights, but most of those flights weren't in the air. West Coast was asleep. They're like a bubbling volcano. East Coast, we're rocking and rolling. We're up and running. If we'd had those extra airplanes, that would have really complicated things. Now, the other one, anybody that's flown to Europe knows Europe has a 6-hour time difference, right? So, you leave at 8 at night, you come early in the morning, right? That saved us. It saved us. Because I was actually working a sector that works overnight into the morning, and I had 25 internationals coming in at 4:30 in the morning. And when you're flying international, you go to Philly, Newark, whatever, you come in over the ocean, you're like a big conga line. Dun, 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 dun. You're just one after another, right? So I got you all on the ground. They were on the ground. They're out of the equation. The other break we caught was the other Europeans, we just put them into other countries. Newfoundland. I understand they wrote a musical about that. I don't really understand that. I mean, they wrote a musical about Titanic, so what the heck, you know? But anyway, so we got those airplanes into other airports, okay? Now, I want to go back to United 93. I didn't forget about United 93. Well, actually, United 93 makes a westbound turn. We're just shoving airplanes on the ground. Sometimes you would just find a sector and you say, he has an airport or he has an airfield. Flash the aircraft at him, and he would dump them on the ground. Other times, you would tell a pilot, Cell 629, ready, 1 o'clock, 30 miles, report airport site, provision post 31, ready, here comes South 620, and boom, ship them. Because all the bets are off, all the rules. I have a friend from Newark Tower that sent me a picture afterwards and said they took the separation standards off so we could just run plane to plane, like right up in seats. He had a picture of 4 airliners touching down on the same road, which would be illegal any other time. It's a pretty killer picture. But anyways, now United 93 is climbing westbound. We found out he was climbing because an American pilot that I was talking to, and I had an altitude on. Oh yeah, I left the subject. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. United 93 and all of the 3 of the hijackers did something nasty. They shut the transponder off. Remember I taught you about vertical separation? I taught you about the transponder? It's a very disconcerting thing when you're working an airplane and suddenly it's a blip. You don't have an altitude. You can't, in principle, as an air traffic controller, you have to separate every other airplane from that airplane from the surface to the height of obstruction to the max altitude of that aircraft, what it can perform. It's a lot of altitudes. So we were trying not to do what they call merging target procedures. Just get everybody away from them, get them on the ground. So United shuts off its transponder. So now we have no idea what altitude United's at. And there's still airplanes out there. And we're just cranking them. An American pilot that we had at a known altitude, United went zipping by him. And he gave us an estimate on the altitude looking out the cockpit. That's how we were estimating altitudes. United 93 would go out to the western boundary of Pennsylvania, make an eastbound turn. The passengers would try, or successfully, I will never know, overpower the hijackers and then would crash. I wrote this down verbatim because it meant so much to me. In the military, we have what's called an after actions report. Anybody that's in the military knows what it is. The FAA, we were like a military organization, so we use it. And I read this and I thought, boy, this is really something. I want you to think about this. Here's the East Coast, just the eastern corridor for 3 hours. 700 aircraft landed in the first 4 minutes. We were dumping them. 2,800 in the first hour. 4,500 within 3 hours. So, 3 hours of airplane 9/11. Thank you. All right, I'll take any questions. I feel like I threw a lot at you. Any questions? I sometimes get emotional about it. I'm sorry.
Was there some code or something that you told all these, that would let all these pilots know
Actually,
that this was
I
happening?
decided not to get into that, but that's a really good question. The frequency gets very congested, and so there's a lot of talking going on, and things get missed. And they have a thing called ACARS. It sits in the middle between the captain and the right seater. It's a printer. I was communicating on that also. So in real time, I was letting every airplane, no, we were letting every airplane, people in Alaska knew. We were letting them know what was going on. So the pilots knew. So everybody there was no questioning. I think Philly, we only had one pilot give us a hard time. And it was a Learjet off Chester County. I think his owner had too much money. And he came off, and obviously, he knew what was going on. And he lifted up, and he didn't want to go back down. And at that time, all we had were AWACS, military fighters, and air ambulances in the air. And he wanted to go on his way, and our AWACS sent four fighters and escorted him back to Chester County. And I happen to know the gentleman never flew again. Yeah, he lost his license. That's a good question, but that was a real asset because, we could spell it out, and then the pilots knew this is not normal, normal duty. Anything else?
So
I'm sorry.
yeah, how did you continue on that day?
Well, we shut everything down.
But I mean, even in there, emotionally, how did you survive that?
They kept me for another 8 hours and debriefed me, and I kept having to say over and over what happened. And then one thing they did was real nice. You get psychological testing, but it was a random. It wasn't like they would go, "Hey, I think he's flipping out," and they offered. In my case, they offered me counseling for the rest of my career. So once a year, I would go see a doctor and just make sure I was sleeping and,
Yeah, I see how emotional you get.
Well, we had a lot of people leave. We did lose people. And I normally don't mention this, but I'm going to mention it anyway. A guy that I went to the academy with, his wife was on one of the planes at the Trade Center. So he was working, and he didn't work again. Yeah, so. I'm sorry, was there another?
Yeah, how long after the planes hit the towers did you know what happened?
Actually, pretty quickly, and I'm embarrassed to say how I knew. Guys were in the break room, and were watching it on TV, and were running into the radar room and telling us. I learned a lot that way, so, I'm sorry.
But you knew already, because of the way the planes were flying, you knew something was wrong.
Oh, no, we knew they were hijacked before they hit the trade centers, yes. Yeah, we knew, yeah. They squawk a code, and also I'm not allowed to, there's a word.
Okay.
So we knew something was up. But the other problem we had was, I think we had three, just in the Eastern Corridor, we had 3 other airliners that we lost communications with. So we sent fighters after them, which I'm sure everybody watched on the news. The coverage was amazing. Sorry, somebody else? Okay. All right, well, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.